Welcome back. I'm Priestess Erika, and this is my YouTube channel where we talk about all things spiritual, really, and really anything else related to that. Today, we're going to talk about something that is very near and dear to my heart as a mystic, and that is the idea of lineages, basically, and various spiritual paths, and touch a little bit on cultural appropriation, spiritual cultural appropriation, um, because that comes into play here. And basically, the main thing we're going to be talking about is why you don't really need that. You don't really need this unbroken lineage kind of a deal. It's nice if you can have it, I guess, but it's almost as much of a stumbling block as it is a benefit, honestly. So in the past, we have touched briefly on how religion is really just taking the journey that a mystic or a group of mystics had and trying to codify it into steps so that others can follow the path. And we've briefly touched on the fact that that isn't actually very effective. You know, you can follow the steps of my journey exactly as someone who is not me and not have the same kind of spiritual experiences, spiritual awakening, and spiritual growth that I have personally had, because that was my path and it's not yours. And there are things about me that made it so that my path caused all of this to happen for me that may not exist for you. This becomes a really big deal because, oh my goodness, I cannot tell you, having been involved in the spiritual community on Facebook in particular, in Facebook groups, how many people, in particular, white people who feel or are disconnected from their own heritage, feel like they really need to find somebody else's path and grasp onto it and use it. And typically, this is a path that is not open to them. You know, I've seen people who have tried to grab onto indigenous North American paths and beliefs, and often use them in ways that are not appropriate, or other closed things like grabbing onto voodoo or hoodoo. And yes, these are both closed. Um, and honestly, while there is truth in really every spiritual path, that doesn't mean that you have to have that one that you find to be super shiny and attractive. If somebody says it's not for you, it's okay to just accept that it isn't for you. And that doesn't mean that there's some kind of spiritual truth that's in that path that you will now never be able to have in this lifetime. I actually had a conversation with someone in person the other day that was sort of the feeling that I got from what they had to say, was that they felt that by these paths in particular, since we live in North America, in particular, indigenous traditions being closed, that this made it so that it was going to be impossible for them to find another meaningful way to connect with the earth, with the land, connect with our local environment, and create a spiritual connection with those things. But you can absolutely do that without stealing somebody else's stuff. So that's what we're going to focus on here, because this obsession with unbroken lineages is really unhealthy, and it ends up leading to a lot of stealing other cultures' spiritual practices, in particular when they have said, no, you can't have this. That's very, very important here. There are certainly some spiritual practices that are very open, that take all comers, Christianity being one, um, and actually nominally nominally Buddhism being another. So it's not just Christianity that this is the case for. And actually, my own tradition, which is Scandinavian heathenry, is also what we call an open tradition. That means anybody who feels that this is a path that is going to be useful for them and is respectful of the path, and so on and so forth, that they can join. But of course, Scandinavian heathenry is not unbroken, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But first, and before my screen shuts off here, I just want to share this very wise quote from Joseph Campbell, who did a lot of work on mythology and actually various spiritual practices and traditions that are non-mythological, that exist currently. And he had to say, where there is a way or path, It is someone else's path. You are not on your own path. If you follow someone else's way, you are not going to realize your potential. And this actually is mirrored in something that I recently read in the Bhagavad Gita, which of course belongs to a closed tradition of Hinduism. But there's a lot of wisdom there, regardless of, I don't claim to practice anything associated with that. But in the Gita, which we have this conversation happening between the character of Arjuna and Lord Krishna. And Krishna is telling Arjuna that in order for you to reach your highest potential in this life, you have to follow your duty. You can't just do whatever you want. You can't look at what your neighbor's doing and say, oh, he looks like a holy person who's got it all put together, so I'm going to do what he's doing. That's not going to work for you. You have to do your own thing. And using the word duty in translation, I don't know how good of a translation that is, honestly. So there's that piece, but also just the implications that the word duty has for us in modern life. And for me in particular, coming from a family that was very obsessed with duty, I don't feel really great about that word, but we can look at that as being, we came here and were born into this lifetime, into this body, this incarnation, to have certain experiences, learn certain lessons, do certain things. And if we try doing somebody else's life, then we're not going to do what we came here to do. And that, that's certainly a choice that we can make, but it's not something that's going to benefit us, really. That's not why we're here. And it's something that is likely going to be very uncomfortable. So back to this lineages thing. There is this concept in the spiritual community of an unbroken lineage, meaning, and and when I say we, I mean specifically spiritual white folks, although we're not the only ones, I think, but I'm only going to speak for us. We're pretty obsessed with this. And I would like to say that I don't understand why, but I kind of do understand why. And it's because a lot of our lineages to our our ancestral traditional beliefs, our pre-Christian beliefs, have been completely smashed, completely destroyed by sort of Christianity. But the reason they were destroyed by Christianity is because people in our own communities brought Christianity in and obliterated the traditions that existed there for the most part. There are exceptions to this, of course, but specifically I'm speaking about Scandinavian heathenry because that is my path. And that is certainly what happened there. When Christianity came to Scandinavia, it was mostly Scandinavians who brought it in, and particularly people in power who saw that this was a very useful religion. And I actually have a whole other video on just this, how these religions, these we have the only truth monotheistic religions, become really great tools for people in power to perpetuate and strengthen and reinforce with religion and spiritual practice power over dynamics with others. So when the leaders at the time saw how useful, just like Constantine, when they Emperor Constantine, where Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, so that's a totally different time and place. But just like him, when they saw how useful Christianity was as a tool, they ended up bringing it in, and the conversion was not peaceful. It was kind of ugly and a bit violent at times, significantly violent at times. But it was our own people doing it to us. So this is a bit different than what happened, for example, in the Americas when Europeans came over bringing Christianity and obliterated, or attempted to, because they certainly did not succeed in the vast majority of cases, attempted to obliterate indigenous spiritual practices and replace them with Christianity for a number of reasons, including specifically the ones that I've just finished talking about how this is a really great, how Christianity as it is today and had become at these times was a really great tool for reinforcing power over dynamics. So it's an excellent tool for colonialism, unfortunately. Regardless, we in the Northwestern European milieu have pretty much had traditions destroyed. There are a few traditions that still exist where there are some unbroken lineages. It's certainly not my own. And Germanic heathenry as well is pretty much obliterated. And so because of that, we feel like we're missing this. We look at other traditions, some African traditional religions, indigenous North American and South American and Central American indigenous traditions, and other Aboriginal traditions in Australia, things like this, where there are unbroken lineages. The people who are the spiritual authorities in those communities, who, whatever the terminology is in whatever tradition and community we're talking about, these people have often been trained by someone who was trained by someone who was trained by someone who was trained by someone, where it can be traced, in way, way, way back, to the dawn of human memory concerning these traditions. And that's a really special thing. I'm not saying that that's not special and that it's somehow wrong or problematic, but I am saying that just because we don't have that doesn't mean we are missing something, like a big piece of something that's going to upset our whole spiritual journey, where we now have to go and find someone who has an unbroken lineage in who cares what tradition and insert ourselves into that tradition. It's an awesome thing to have an unbroken lineage. It's really, the direct, continuous transmission of ancestral knowledge like that is super incredible. And it's an amazing thing. I'm not going to say that there's anything bad about it, but there is nothing that says that when we don't have that we will somehow be spiritually stunted. And this was sort of part of the feeling that I was getting in this conversation I had the other day, is this idea of, well, if nobody says I can be a part of their tradition, then I guess that means I'm just screwed and I'm just not allowed to have a spiritual path and a spiritual experience and spiritual growth in this lifetime. And of course, that's not true. That's not true at all. Definitely not. You don't even need to have a tradition of any kind, with a lineage of any kind, broken or unbroken, in order to have a spiritual experience spiritual growth, and live a spiritual life. And I can say this with extreme certainty as a mystic. I started my own spiritual journey when I can't even tell you what age I was, because I don't remember. probably as soon as I became a conscious being, because of how my brain works, because of how I am so woven into the spiritual nature of the world around me, and kind of never stopped. I mean, most children are, but most children get trained out of it. And fortunately, I think because of my neurodivergences, it was never able to be trained out of me. I think because I didn't see it as something unusual. I thought that everybody had these experiences that I was having. And it wasn't until much later that I realized that was not the case. In fact, some of these realizations I've had about how my experience has been very, very different have happened within the last 5 years of my life. So I lived the majority of my life thinking that a lot of the experiences I had were just normal and very, not so much even very accessible to everyone, but so accessible that you couldn't help but have these experiences, and therefore everyone was having them. And that, I know now, is not entirely true. But I also know that even though I have my neurodivergences, and so therefore, compared to someone who's neurotypical, there are things about me that, and about how my brain works, that are different, and that has a lot to do with some of the experiences I've had. I also know that these experiences are not exclusive, in the sense that it isn't just me, it isn't just neurodivergent folks. Anyone can have experiences like this. And some of us, because of how our brains are, it's a little bit easier for us to get there. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible for other people to get there. Like we opened with talking about, religion is simply the codification in basically every instance that I have looked at. It is simply the codification of an individual or a group of individuals' spiritual journey that led them to spiritual awakening, spiritual advancement, which then they or somebody observing them tried to write down so that others could follow the path and have the same experience. But as we've just as we've just covered here with Joseph Campbell's words and Lord Krishna's words from the Bhagavad Gita, if you are following somebody else's path, you're not going to get there. So while the intent behind codifying this into religion is a worthy endeavor, unfortunately, it doesn't always work out. I mean, eventually, eventually, if you're following the path with the intention, you will find your own path. And of course, there are so many people on the planet that there may be a religion out there that is close enough to what your path is, that by following the steps in that religion, you will achieve that spiritual awakening. And I think it is the existence of that happening that convinces people that it is effective to follow a religion, uh, and exclusively, like, not try to have your own experiences, just follow the steps of the religion and have the mystical experience. Because really, when we're being honest, what we talk about as the spiritual experience really is the mystical experience. This experience of being one with the divine, one with nature, one with the all that is. And I haven't yet done any videos that really delve into my personal beliefs about how the world works, and um, how soul and spirit works, and all of that. We've talked a little bit about it here in bits and pieces along the various videos, but the fact remains that regardless of the path you're on, if we look at, there are, for example, let's take this. There are, for example, across the globe, just about everywhere you look, you can find animist traditions. And animist, which is to say that there is this belief that everything has a soul or a spirit, essentially, and not just things that we commonly think of as being alive. So not just plants and animals, but also the earth, the soil, rocks, created objects. So like the house that I live in has a soul, from an animist perspective, and that's the perspective I have, so that's what I believe. The backdrop that I'm using, et cetera, that we are all essentially saying what we say in the modern spiritual community, where we talk about us all being energy, that everybody, everything is energy. That's essentially another way of talking about this, and saying that we're all alive, we're all feeling, we're all conscious, we're all consciousness. So that's essentially kind of a rough and dirty overview of what animism is. And so, as I said, we can find animist traditions everywhere. I don't know that there is a place on the globe where we have not found some evidence of there being animist traditions, even if they don't exist today. Some of them have been completely obliterated. And of course, some cultures have been completely wiped out over time. And then others have risen to take their place. And we have some evidence, for example, in cave paintings, that this was something that was believed back then. And of course, we have no idea if those traditions still exist in some form, that they evolved into something that we have today, or if they were in fact wiped out. But this seems to be, when we really get down to the brass tacks here, this seems to be what I hesitate to use the word religion, but what the spirituality of humanity is, when we really get down to the basics, is that it is animist in nature. And that said, as long as you are not following any specific animist tradition that is closed to you, there are plenty of ways of working with animist ideas that are not associated with closed traditions, because it is so ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Nobody can say as a culture that they own the idea of everything having a spirit and everything having life, because we find that everywhere. It just seems to be a human thing, rather than a thing of any particular culture of humans, or any particular region of humans. And certainly when we look at the tradition that I follow, the ancient Scandinavian traditions, at least from what evidence we have and what we can tell about them, they certainly seem to have some roots in animism, although a lot of the evidence that we have comes from a time that's perhaps a little beyond that, where we've got more religion happening and less of the animism, although there is still animism happening there. So all of this to say that really, instead of looking for the tradition that is right for you, because certainly that's some people's approach to religion and spirituality, and there, I'm not saying that there's anything particularly wrong with that either. There's something very comforting in that. The whole reason that I ended up leaving Christianity, it's a long and convoluted story that involves in part the things that I talked about in the monotheism video, learning about the Council of Nicaea and Constantine, and how politics were a major factor in developing the Christian religion that we have today. And that really was what broke it for me, where I was like, well, then why am I holding on to this so tightly if it's all basically politics? Because at this point in the journey, I had already done this other piece, and this other piece is the important piece. A couple years before then, I had gotten very curious about what my ancestral traditions were, and I am fortunate enough to have a number of family members who are pretty connected to our roots. A large portion of my dad's family is German Austrian. We know that for a fact. We know when parts of the family came over to North America, et cetera, et cetera. And then on my mom's side, my mother's mother, my mormor, is actually from Sweden. She is Swedish, and emigrated when she was, I think, in her late teens. She came to North America. So that is the part of my my personal history that I'm the most connected to, because of course she is very connected to that culture and those traditions, and she was very excited, thankfully, to pass those on to her children and her grandchildren instead of just assimilating. Despite the fact that she was Christian and that her family, I think, was largely atheist, there were still a lot of very curious folk tales, folk traditions, things like this that she passed on to us. And these are the things that still exist. So as we talk about the idea that there are really no unbroken lineages in specifically Scandinavian heathenry, that's mostly true. There certainly is no existing tradition of volur, for example, the professional magic workers of the time, that exists today, that is connected through apprentice and mentors all the way back to Iron and Bronze Age and previous. That is not the case. But there are all of these folk traditions that have carried on, despite the fact that my grandmother, my mormor's family, was likely at some point in their history Christian, and then not so much, more atheist agnostic at the time that she was born into the family, and then she came back to being quite a I'm not sure what the word is I want to look for here. I'm not sure zealous is the right word, but quite a committed Christian. So she was very, very Christian, but also a person who had deep, deep spiritual practice. So partly what I'm saying here is that you could find this spiritual practice in any religion, but there is something comforting if you have some idea of your ancestry, or you find an open tradition that resonates with you. It's nice to have that framework, that structure, those stories. As humans, we love stories. So all the myths that come with the tradition, the stories that the purpose of these stories, if you look at the mythology, I don't like talking in absolutes because there's a lot that I don't know. But I'm just going to venture a guess, because certainly the cultures whose mythology I have studied, this is pretty much universally true for them. And I've studied a fair amount of mythology. It's one of my things that I just love. The point of these myths, really, I mean, there are certainly things like cautionary tales and things of those genres, but a lot of it is really about taking the things you need to walk your own successful spiritual path, those deep spiritual truths, and putting them into stories in such a way that if you know what you're looking for, you will find what you need. And even if you don't know what you're looking for, because of the collective unconscious and how these stories resonate within us with the collective unconscious and within our own personal unconscious and subconscious, these stories will help you get there even if you don't know what you're looking for and you can't find the concrete instructions. But in a lot of these myths, and certainly this isn't true for every myth, but in a lot of these myths, if you know what you're looking for in the metaphors and understand how those metaphors are understood in the cultural context and historical context that the myth in the version we have today came out of, a lot of them do contain very deep spiritual wisdoms and essentially secrets to that if you're initiated, if you're a spiritual initiate and you have that level of understanding, you can use them as instruction manuals for how to get to the next step. So that absolutely exists, and having those traditions is very useful to help you get there, definitely. So I'm not discounting being connected to a tradition that speaks to you that is also open for you. But on the other hand, you know, there are plenty of us, myself included, who have these experiences when we are so young that it isn't really because we've followed any particular religious path or any particular prescribed spiritual path, because this animist nature of the world is there for us to perceive, to feel, and to have an interaction with, a relationship with, if you will. And this is where the truth really lies. And I know that it is a lot of work to put together your own spiritual path. And if you are watching this video and you don't feel that any traditions that are open resonate with you and you are deciding to create your own traditions, I know a number of people who that's what they're doing, and I think it's a very worthy endeavor. But I do just want to caution you, as they have all taught me, that one must be cautioned, that when you're doing that, you need to be careful when you create a new ritual or other practice, that you are creating it perhaps with inspiration from things that are open, but that you're not taking something that you have read or heard of that belongs to somebody else and stealing it kind of unintentionally. You know, humans have a brain that is really good at doing that kind of stuff, so we have to be careful about that. But that aside, it's certainly possible to create your own practices. And I know that those are consistently the most meaningful practices compared to if I were to, for example, walk into the Catholic Church and do some of their practices with them. There is certainly this, we've talked about this before, I think, this idea of neurologic entrainment, energetic entrainment, where if you are with a group of people who are all starting to kind of have a spiritual experience, you're more likely to have a spiritual experience. So certainly when I have attended Catholic Mass, as I have a couple of times, I can feel the spiritual experience that is happening there. That is happening. It's definitely there, even though what we have there are lots of people trying to follow the same path. If we give ourselves some freedom, we find that we don't follow the path exactly. And that's perfect. That is entirely how it should be. I know for myself, for the large portion of my life that I was a Christian, that's pretty much how it was for me. You know, my family practiced in a particular way, and they trained me up to practice in that way as well. You know, this is how indoctrination works. This is how raising children in a religious tradition works. And in these traditions in particular, there's a lot of emphasis on we don't do our own thing. We do the things the way that they've been done because that's the right way, and so on and so forth. But really, from the start of receiving that kind of education, I was consistently on a personal quest for a spiritual experience, spiritual knowledge, all of these kinds of things that I knew because I was going to church. I was doing the things at church, at the particular church that my family went to, and I was frequently not having spiritual experiences at church. I knew that wasn't going to work. it had proven itself to me that consistently it wasn't working. Occasionally it did work, but it didn't work every time. So obviously, this was not really a great tool for me to create consistent mystical spiritual experiences. And I found lots of other things that were, uh, like taking a hike, for example, or going and riding my horse, or even just hanging out with my horse or my other fur babies. Because really, this spiritual experience that we're looking for, again, it boils down to this animist understanding of the world and being connected to the beings around us. And certainly there are beings around us that we don't necessarily want to be connected to, so we need to be careful about that. And those of us, like myself, who were not raised in animist traditions, um, we don't really get a lot of help there. If you were raised in a tradition like mine, I was raised in a fairly Pentecostal, fairly charismatic, spiritual Christian spiritual tradition. So there was an understanding of, I'm trying to find the word that they like to use, but I can't find it just now. But of there being a spiritual realm that kind of overlaps this realm, and of there being unseen entities, some of whom are good and some of whom are bad. We have angels and demons, for example. So I wasn't completely exposed to negative spirits growing up, because I saw basically every spirit that I was able to see as a demon. And so I kept my distance and used the protective rituals that I was taught in Christianity to keep myself safe from them. And as I have grown and gotten to know the spirits around me better, I realized that what I perceived as demons were largely not, and that most of them were spirits that absolutely had my best interests in mind. They just didn't look the way that I had been told they would look. And they were mostly telling me things that my training at the time told me was wrong and bad and evil. For example, universalist ideas of there is no right path, and that every path will lead you to the truth eventually. And that's something that the brand of Christianity I was involved with anyway is vehemently opposed to, and says that's absolutely wrong, and that is definitely not the case, and that this is the only true path, and unless you're walking this path, you won't reach the truth. And that's not what my little spirit buddies were saying, who I was unfortunately enemies with for many years of my life. But these spirits exist. These non-corporeal entities that essentially live on a different plane than we do, but this plane and that plane overlap, so we can have some contact with them, even though we typically don't see them. I say typically because I have seen them, and some of us can see them, and some people do who don't regularly see them can have experiences where you will all of a sudden see them. But even if you are not comfortable believing in them or working with them, they exist whether you believe in them or not. But if you aren't comfortable with thinking about them and working with them, there's so much else. They're just connecting to plants and animals, which has been my entire life for a lot of reasons. Connecting with animals, because of my neurodivergence, I suspect, connecting with animals has always been easier for me than connecting with humans. And so connection with animals has been a big part of my spiritual path, even before I knew it was. Connection with animals is essentially my religion, and has been ever since before I knew I should call it that. And just being able to respect, honor, and connect with the spirits that live inside of other beings, as we talk about in this animist conception of the world, where everything has a spirit or a soul, whatever term you'd like to use. I use them interchangeably, although I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. But my understanding of spirit and soul come from the Christian understanding, and I disagree with what they have to say about that at this point in my life. So all of this to say that you, by following your own path, by exploring the connection that you have with the world around you, that this will be enough. I'm going to say that again. you exploring the connection that you have with the world around you on a spiritual level will be enough. You don't need to take anybody else's path, anybody else's tradition, whether it's open or not. You don't need to have any of that in order to live a spiritual life, to experience spiritual growth and advancement, to experience spiritual awakening. You don't have to have any any established spiritual path, any religion in order for that to happen. You just have to be open for that to happen and curious about it. Sometimes is just enough. And if you feel like that's not enough for you, then I would encourage reaching out to the entities around you, whether those be non-corporeal entities, if you're comfortable with them, although that tends to be potentially a little more dangerous. So I would definitely, if you're going to do that, I would definitely recommend doing some protection work as well. And that this is where it gets tricky if you don't have your own um, spiritual home, essentially, in the traditions that exist. But it isn't impossible, because we are sovereign beings, and us deciding a thing is extremely powerful. So even if you don't have a ritual that you can do that helps you feel comfortable and helps you feel like you have accomplished the thing, just getting ready to reach out to non-corporeal beings and deciding as you do that, that I am sovereign, I am safe, and this is my space, and only what I allow into my space is allowed here. And if somebody comes into my space, corporeal or not, and I decide that I don't want them here, that I can tell them to leave, and they must respect me because this is my space. And that is very, very powerful, so long as you completely believe it. And this is why sometimes, in speaking with people, in reading various people's writings about working with non-corporeal spirits, some people talk about how that may not be enough, and some of these spirits are so dangerous that and malicious that might not be enough. But really, it is, if you 100% believe that it is. When you don't, that's when things get a little wobbly, and that is where the power of ritual comes in, because when humans use ritual, it makes it very much easier for us to believe that the thing has worked. So that is the power of ritual, and you can create your own rituals. Um, I'm just going to offer a few suggestions here, since we're talking about creating our own things. In many, many cultures, salt is used for cleansing and protection, and that's it, certainly in my own path. That's the case, and so it's something that is open and available. So if you've ever heard about using salt in windows, doorways, portals, basically, to like a line of salt to be a protective line, that's a thing, and it's a thing that is open. So you can use that if you would like. And cleaning, physical cleaning is very powerful. So if something is in your space that you do not want in your space, and you have decided to tell them to go, and you feel like they haven't listened to you, or you feel like maybe that wasn't powerful enough and they might come back, just physically cleaning your space with the intention that you are cleaning out anything that doesn't belong here and you are reclaiming your space, that alone is very powerful. Doing whatever cleaning you do, vacuuming, sweeping, wiping things up, whatever it is that you typically do as far as a cleaning ritual, even though it's not necessarily a spiritual ritual that you are doing. It can be, anything can be. And that's really the beauty of this. And this is also why it's nice to have a tradition that comes with some prepackaged rituals and things like that. But anything you do can be a ritual if you do it with the right intention. And for example, this idea that becoming a part of a tradition gives you prepackaged rituals, sure, but they may not work super well for you if you just use them as they are out of the box, so to speak. The best way for these things to work, and if you look at how things change over time, how different people do different things differently, um, different folk traditions, for example, differently in different households or in different regions. It's because they all come from the same maybe base ritual, but for each individual person, that base ritual is not necessarily equally effective. And so doing it slightly differently, whether that's a different time of day or with different objects or with a different incantation, if you want to speak a thing, saying words that are different than what your neighbor says, might be more effective for you. And this is why we find so much variation in traditions. Some of it is just that if for example, I am sharing a cleansing ritual with my neighbor, maybe they don't remember everything I said perfectly, and so they kind of improvise a little bit. But a lot of it is because people are changing things to meet their current needs, whether that is because what they were given doesn't feel super effective, and so they tweak it to make it feel super effective, or maybe what they were given involves using something that they don't have access to, and so they replace it with something they do have access to. If we're talking about particular ritual tools or herbs or other various things like that, um, this improvisation, this being able to swap out what you don't have for something that you do have that works in a similar way, is a hugely important thing in traditional spiritual practices, because we don't always have with us what we might need to make something happen, and we might need to make something happen. I Growing up in this Christian tradition that I was in, I was taught primarily the power of the spoken word, and not even any particular spoken word, because I was raised in a, like I said, a Pentecostal charismatic tradition. So we didn't do a lot of the pre-written prayers like, for example, Catholics and Episcopalians might do. So most of what we did was just kind of as the situation called for. And that taught me a lot about improvising. And it's something that we see across traditions. So you do what feels most effective for you, so long as you're not stealing anybody's practices. But there are lots of things that you can do, lots of ways that you can clean your space, and protect yourself. And most of them just have to do with deciding that it is so. And some of them, if you work with deities or things like that, sometimes calling on those deities if they're particularly good at protection. So for example, in my tradition, if you're looking for protection, the one you might call on would be Thor. Generally speaking, if you have a personal relationship with a different deity who has a vested interest in protecting you because of that relationship, then it might be a little different for you. But generally speaking, the general Norse deity that you call on for protection and for sacralizing things is Thor. So all of this to say that really it doesn't matter what path you have or have not available to you, because any path that isn't yours isn't right. You can go to an open tradition that even has an unbroken lineage, like Christianity, for example, and use all of their rituals and do everything by the book where it should be working, and it might do nothing for you because it's not your path. And that's the key, is taking what is your path. And that can be very tricky at times. I completely understand that, in part because we have a society, partly because of what was done with Christianity and how that has informed what we think spirituality should look like in our modern world, where we feel like we're not allowed to be the sovereign authority of our own path and our own life. So it can be when you're first embarking on this adventure of finding your own way, it can be very disorienting. And there are certainly places where it can become dangerous or otherwise challenging, or otherwise painful. And there are plenty of us out here that want to make it easier for you. There are certainly, like I said, I've been involved in Facebook spiritual communities, so that exists. Although I definitely would urge caution there. I've had some very interesting experiences in a lot of different groups. So take the good, leave the bad, and try to be discerning about which is which can be challenging again when you're early on your path. And of course, I think the best way to go about any of this is having a mentor. Certainly that's how it used to be done. If we look at generally humanity historically, and how people who were on spiritual journeys used to express that. Often they would have a mentor, or go to the monastery, or whatever it was that they did in their culture, to have some people around who had experience with walking spiritual paths, and hopefully with walking their own path, taking whatever cultural rituals and beliefs they have, and making it individualized enough that it is your path. um, and so I think that the very best way to do this is by having a mentor. And that is something that I do. It's one of the services that I offer. So if you are feeling called to start stepping out on your individual spiritual path, and also feeling perhaps confused or a bit lost, or perhaps paralyzed because you don't know what tradition that exists is appropriate for you, open to you, safe for you, maybe even a good match for you, and you're very concerned about stepping on other people's toes and all of that sort of thing, which is very commendable, but can make things even thornier. If you are in that place, I would be happy to help. And I'm going to put, as usual, my contact information in the description here, so that if you are interested, you can reach out and we can have a conversation about that. And of course, if you liked this video and this content, then like the video and the content. And also don't forget to subscribe and hit the little alert bell so that you will be notified the next time I put out one of these videos. I try to do one every week. I took a week off last week, but I try to do one every week. And pretty soon here, I'm going to end up doing 2. I don't think it will be today, but within the next couple of weeks, because I have another teeny piece that I forgot, because I was so focused on physical evidence. I forgot to put this little teeny piece in the video about queer taboos. That is such an important piece. So I'm going to do a quickie video on that, so that that can be there for all of you as well. If you have any questions that this video brought up, I know this is some really, can be some really tricky stuff. If you have any questions or any comments, if anything I said sparked anything in you, inspired you, or confused you, or angered you, triggered you, please leave a comment. I would love to have a conversation about that in the comments. Bye for now.